Hello, today we're going to do lesson 19, exponents, powers of negative numbers, roots, and evaluation of powers. Now remember that x to the n, what it means is how many times x is multiplying itself. So the power, the n, tells us how many times the x is multiplying. So in this case, we have n times. Now let's look at it with examples. For example, if we have x to the fourth power, it means we have 4 x's. And that's it. Now, 1/3 to the fifth power means that we have 1/3 5 times. In this case, we can simplify because we can say what is 1/3 times 1/3 times 1/3 times 1/3. And in this case, it will be 1/243. Then negative 4 to the second power is negative 4 2 times, so negative 4 times negative 4. In this case, I have to consider the negative, so negative times negative, positive 16. Now let's see what happens if I have negative numbers with exponents. In this case, 5 squared is just going to be 5 times 5, which is 25. In this case, it's 5 times 5 times 5, which is 125. Now notice that these are positive numbers, so we don't really have to worry about the sign. It's just going to be positive. And then 5 to the fourth power is going to be 625. Now notice in this case that the form is affecting only the 5. So I have to leave the negative on the outside. Why is that happening? Well, it's because the negative is outside of the power. And so we have 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. And so there's only one negative, so it's negative 625. Now in the purple examples, we have parentheses that is including the negative in the power. So it's a negative number that is a square. So negative 2 to the second power is negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4, because negative times negative is positive. Then we have negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Now remember that if we have an odd amount of negatives, the answer is going to be negative, and then 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. In the next example, we have negative 2 4 times. So with an even amount of negatives, we have positive, and that would be 16. Finally, we have to simplify first these, and then we multiply times the negative. So I'm going to keep the negative there, and then I'm going to multiply negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. And in this case, we have 5 negatives, so the answer is negative 16. What we have to realize is the parenthesis affects if the negative is being multiplied or not. Let's look at these examples where we simplify sometimes with parentheses and sometimes with no parentheses. In this case, there's no parentheses, so I have to remember that the exponent goes first and then the multiplication. So 2 to the third power is 8, but I have to put the negative because it's in front. Then we have a negative, and then we do this exponent. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Now, why do I have a negative? Because this negative has to come there to multiply. Then we have plus, and then negative 3 to the second power, which is positive 9. Now we have negative 8 minus 4 is negative 12, and negative 12 plus 9 is negative 3. And that's our answer. Let's look at the next example. Again, we have a number that does not have a parenthesis, so that's going to be negative 9. Then we have the negative 5, and then this negative 2 to the third power, notice how it has a parenthesis. So the negative 2 is multiplied times negative 2 and then another negative 2. So the answer will be negative 8. Then we have another negative 2 multiplying negative 3 squared, which is negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9, and then the 5. Now again, notice that we have to do order of operations, first multiplication here. So we'll put the negative 9. Negative 5 times negative 8 is positive 40. And then we have negative 18 and minus 5. Remember, we do positives and negatives first, and then we subtract them. So we have negative 9 minus 18 is negative 27, minus 5 is negative 32. And if I subtract this, it's going to be positive 8. In this section, we're going to review roots. Now remember that a root has a number inside here that is called the index. And then we also have the radical inside. What the root is asking is which number multiplied by itself n amount of times gives me the number that is inside. So for example, when I say what is the square root of 36, what I'm asking is, remember that even though there's not a number there, there's a 2. That's the square root. It's a 2. And so the question is, the square root of 36, which number multiplied by itself 2 times gives me 36? And the answer is 6, because 6 times 6 is 36. Now with the fourth root of 81, what it's asking me is which number multiplied by itself 4 times gives me 81. And the answer is 3. Why? Because 3 times 3 times 3 times 3 gives 81. In the next example, we have the cubic root of negative 64. And again, that is asking which number multiplied by itself 3 times gives me negative 64. And in this case, the answer is negative 4. And again, if we multiply negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4, we get negative 64. Now notice in this case, we have a negative in front of the square root. And that's just going to tell me that I have to find the square root of 100, which is 10, and put the negative in front. Now let's see evaluation with powers. So remember that every time we evaluate, what we have to do is put a parenthesis first. That's the first step. And then we put the value, which in this case is a equals negative 3. Now, since it has a parenthesis because it was the value of a, then we have to multiply negative 3 times negative 3, which is 9. In this case, I do the same, and I put the negative in front and then the negative 3 inside of the parentheses. Remember, order of operations tells me to do this first, so I keep the negative, and then I have here negative 3 times negative 3, which is 9. And negative 9 would be my answer. In this case, I have negative 3 to the third power. That's going to be, if I write it down, it's going to be negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. Notice there are 4 negatives, and so the answer is going to be positive 27. Finally, I have negative 3 to the third power. So I first have to simplify what is inside of the parentheses, and then I'm going to simplify the power, or the exponent. So in this case, it's 3 positive to the third power, which is also positive 27. Let's do another evaluation. In this case, we have a multiplication. So I'm going to write the parentheses instead of the letters. In this case, x is 3, y is negative 5, and z is negative 2. I simplify using the same rules we were talking before, and that would be 3 squares 9 times negative 5, and then negative 2 to the third power is going to be negative 8, because there are 3 negatives. Negative times negative is positive. 5 times 8 is 40, and 40 times 9 is 360. And that would be the answer for that exercise. In this other example, we have the same. We have a multiplication and then a subtraction. So I'm going to change each letter for a parenthesis. And now we're going to change the values. Remember to do order of operations. So we have negative 3 squared, which is 9. And I keep my parentheses because I'm still multiplying. Negative 4 to the third power is negative 64 because we have 3 negatives. And then we multiply negative 1 times 9 is negative 9. And then negative times negative is positive 64. Notice it's 1 positive and 1 negative. So we subtract and the answer is 55 positive. And that's it. This is a very simple lesson. You just have to be careful with the parentheses and the number of negatives. Have fun doing math.